Alright, hello guys, and glad to have you on board again today. I've decided to put my face into this video, but once again, my face is not what matters in here, it's the content, so we're gonna go straight into this. So, what are we gonna be talking about today? This is an important video that I wanted to make for quite some time, but I feel that right now, the headlines are introducing these topics, so I really wanted to give it a deep dive into these things. I've seen recently lots of people communicating about the fact that some core Ethereum protocols were migrating to Cosmos. And this is something that happened in the past. We've seen multiple of these protocols either deploying or being copied into some other layer 1 alternatives, basically AVAX and also Polkadot as its own copies. But in that perspective, I wanted to give it a kind of a broader vision of this thing. Is there really a competition ever going to happen between Cosmos and Ethereum? Has there ever been a competition between AVAX and Ethereum? Just like Polkadot has sometimes been compared as an ETH killer or something like that. So are these just yet another set of foolish assumptions? The answer, to be clear, is going to be yes, but we're going to argue about that. But most importantly, in that video, I wanted to give it some more depth to try letting you understand which current stage of development our crypto ecosystem is, because I think we're way more mature than some people actually think we are. I've seen some people talking about the fact that we're headed into a 2 years long bear market because of Bitcoin halving cycles. I would tend to say makes no sense to me, but I'll try explaining why today. In terms of ecosystem maturity, I would take a model that I will share with you guys today, which is a model that I think is way more appropriate than just trying to copy the development of back then the World Wide Web. Because if we're headed into Web 3, I think Web 3 is more of an intercommunication standards than just replicating www World Wide Web. So in that perspective, there were some similarities in here as well, and I definitely understand the guys who've been using that as a reference model, the web development, to go ahead of Web 3, but I think this is definitely not the way it is. I think that what the World Wide Web is for us, it's the first way humans back then organized themselves into groups of individuals. That's how we've orchestrated the way informations were to communicate within a network. So if we take that back then into a similar situation, I would say World Wide Web, so 2000 bubble, is pretty much like the way we've tried to create the first civilizations by bringing people together, basically trying to create very complex interactions between these until they reach the top and blow it all off. Until, of course, over time, these things structures themselves and created some kind of an organization structure. This is the World Wide Web we ended up with years after the 2000 bubble. It organized itself into servers, different locations, and stuff like that. So this is how these things turn out to mature. And now we're in the final stage of maturity for these things. We're starting to see that we need decentralization. It's been chaotically, randomizedly organized, but now we need to put a structure to the web. That is what Web 3 is all about. We have different actors, but we need an organization for this because, well, otherwise the web doesn't work. That's what Web 3 is all about. And I think it follows exactly the same path as we did back then when humans tried to gather, started to do such a thing, start to organize themselves into tiny society, villages, basically. But when they had to build cities, because building city out of a village isn't an easy thing. So I'm going to tell you why I personally chosen for this model of looking at ancient cities development, how they build themselves through times, what were the mechanics at play to create these organizational structure that led us out of villages into higher complex city standards. So this is what I will try to say and explain today. So it, of course, is no more than a model. So you have to understand that no models can predict the future. This is just no more than an indicated guess of some kind. So sharing knowledge today, not sharing strategies, even though, as usual, by the end of that video, we'll have a look at charts to see how in rational terms you can forecast some of these probabilities to be more or less probable than others. So let's dive into this. What we do today is studying, first of all, history of how ancient cities build themselves, the similarities we see with existing Web3 potential ecosystems, not to mention them, Cosmos, AVAX, and Polkadot are going to be the three ones we're going to be talking today. Of course, this is a non-exhaustive list. There might be some other competitors which I didn't even mention, but the thing is that I'm going to take the three headliners and see what similarities they have with the model that we see today in description. So let's get it started. Okay, so this is what we have, and I'll use as a model. So this is basically an ancient city being represented graphically. And in that perspective, what we're going to study in the first place is how these things orchestrated through time. How did we ended up from this, which is random chaotic organization, basically farm fields on whatever, and these things regrouped themselves as villages. And how did we come from this to this? What were the intermediate stages? And therefore, if that's the model, where are we on the different ecosystems that we've mentioned before? So let's get it started. Okay, so the first thing that occurred over time when these villagers were just randomly organizing themselves is that quickly we can see that over time, some kind of different rarities of objects have emerged, meaning that some kind of a higher class has been created within the villagers, okay, the farmers and so on, and we started to see some more complex objects with higher standards and higher values emerging like out of nowhere, kind of as if naturally two classes separated themselves, the farmers and the traders, or people who were changing and exchanging goods, and therefore kind of extracted value out of something else than just creating their food and getting to pick up their water. So they started to create some different types of economic activities that they quickly find as being more lucrative. And they're basically setting themselves as a different set of people which wanted a higher standard of living. So they quickly put themselves away from these farmers and wanted to put a bit of a distance. But quickly, what we see is that as these guys had to be fed, they bought out the food from the farmers, and at some point they started to create kind of a cost, meaning that there has been some kind of submission type of behavior in which these guys thought they were better and so on. So over history, what quickly happened is that two things occurred. On some cities, these things terminated themselves, likely because the farmers cut some head off. On some other things, we've seen some more advanced way of building homes. They've started to create more solid homes, rocks, and bigger things like that. They started to create the ancient way of building castles. Firstly, by building higher standards of houses with bigger level of security associated with them. They couldn't be burnt as easily or whatever. They just put themselves into higher security standards, likely to protect themselves from potential cut-off attacks. So in that perspective, this is how over time it quickly emerged from more advanced housing to very complex castle building. And in that perspective, a castle is no more than a house with multiple rooms for multiple people, not just in the end kind of being the home of a single family, but being the home of a diversified family through generations. So multiple people living in the same place, both requiring to be fed from farmers. So even more introducing this subsidiary system in which these guys have to produce food to feed these fuckers. So in that perspective, they had to have higher standards of security to avoid having their heads cut off. So this is how castles created themselves likely in the past. Or there might be some other complex situations that led to this, but let's call it more than enough. What matters to us is that the diversification of trading perspectives came out of pure feeding ourselves and drinking to, well, making more complex kinds of trades and therefore having a different lifestyle. And we wanted to put a difference from these lifestyles because these guys wants to be us, so we have to protect us to remain us. Okay, this is really the way it is. By subsidiarizing these guys, they had to bring their castles into motions. What we've seen next is that as those castles become so big, they required some of the farmers to create some of the basic needs for them, meaning that some of the more advanced needs, like for example, the horse guy, the weapon guy or something, we wanted these guys closer to us, so we decided for them to live next to the castle. We give them the authorization to live next to the castle and eventually use the security of the castle when necessary. You still have your own homes and you're living next to the castle, but when the hard time comes, you're free to enter the castle. and be secured by our walls so that other people won't cut your head off. So that's the first thing that emerged. Then, as these ecosystems developed over time and grew bigger, at some point, kind of like little cities ended up created next to the castle. They were just there to feed the castle's main needs, like basic foods and all of these things, because they wanted to set themselves apart from the old farmers' things. So there was distance, and then there was kind of a smaller city building itself in the nearby castle area. The thing is that over time, as these things grew, these guys were not able to all enter the castle in times of trouble. So these guys decided, well, we want our own security. We want walls. We want another set of security with a gate so that we are protected more than what these guys are. So there are now 3 layers of security: the unsecured, the mid-secured, and the higher level of security. Okay? Though at that stage, okay, if we look for similarities in terms of how the crypto market created itself over time, first we had Bitcoin, which is its own thing. Okay, Bitcoin is more like a commodity. It's like, in my personal opinion, like understanding how to exploit rocks. And what the fuck are we going to be doing with rocks? Well, we're going to do multiple things. Like rocks and metals is what Bitcoin is to the crypto market. It's the fundamental elements. So it helped create our castle. It helped create Ethereum, where more complex transactions have been built out of just farming land and things like that. So Ethereum has its own kind of existence out of Bitcoin, but it needs a Bitcoin. And in that perspective, well, this definitely looks like what we have. We had Bitcoin, then we created more complex activities with it. Out of just farming, we created different costs and different models of economy. Then this economy matured to create needs for layer 2 in order to scale. There were too much demand in a castle, so in that perspective, we had to build a city around it. Then the city required to land the security as well, so this is kind of, we've built a bigger castle. This is the way we are now. Okay, and then lots of other ecosystems ended up creating naturally over these things. These are altnet layer 1s. So out of these altnet layer 1s, there is kind of a current competition on what system will emerge as the recurring and reference system, just like I think the way ancient cities build themselves around castles is going to be my reference. So this is why I use this model, because that is not perfect. You might agree or disagree with it, but this is the one I used. And here's why, because I have proof from current developments in the crypto sector that there are some quite interesting similarities into the way these things build over time. So this is step 1. This didn't exist. It was just farmers in a castle. And then as more complex economic activity settles, we've started to see something. Like out of farming, we have more complex economic activity. It's not just feeding ourselves, not just getting rich. It's creating economy, okay, more complex interactions with it. Okay, Bitcoin is like feeding. Ethereum is like bringing economy and collectivity on top of just feeding ourselves. It's a higher standard, okay? So understand this. If cities have to be built, because this is what happened in our ancient history, out of castles, cities have built. If layer 1s are these cities, let's look at the similarities on how these cities built out of just a castle, an isolated castle first. Well, over time, what we see is that those cities didn't build all at once. It's definitely not something that built itself over time, in a single day. It took hundreds of years to build and orchestrate. By first seeing some more complex activity going out of just feeding, and like, this is basically craftsmen that emerged themselves as creating into randomly, chaotically organized kind of subsets. So in that perspective, it's just craftsmen who started to do something else than just feeding. So they were taking materials or whatever and doing more complex things with it and selling them to some other people or something like that. They were creating stuff, the craftsmen basically. But they were randomly putting themselves. What we see over time is that as these guys pull themselves, they do not necessarily absolutely randomly pull themselves. This is random. They go wherever place is available and they will settle out there. But the thing is that there is one first structure they will always respect over time, is that they will always leave pathway for communication to occur. They will always leave kind of boulevards in which, well, if you're dumb enough to settle your house in a boulevard, we're going to destroy it because that's where we fucking pass. So there were pathways that naturally emerged out of randomly chaotic plotting. People were randomly plotting themselves, but they always let it room for streets to build. So that's the first thing. These cities were randomly plotted, but they had they had streets. The second thing is that every ancient city is built out of an unplotted area where removable markets ended up created quickly. So there were areas in which you couldn't build because they were temporary traded structures, or structures meant for temporary trades. Okay, that's the second thing that emerged. The third thing is that over time, as these structures created themselves, meaning that they created randomly some kind of streets and subsets of streets, depending on how frequented these areas were, the bigger the area were. Like the boulevard were where the main people circulations were, and then there were tinier streets, but this was really not something hard-coded. This was really literally chaos pulling itself in front of our eyes. These things created naturally and organically. And then what we see, which is very interesting, is that at some point in the maturity of these cities, there start to be some kind of a specialization, meaning that we start to see some kind of concurring things from multiple craftsmen. They start to do the same things, okay? And they do some of the same things, but in different areas. Like, for example, if we take some pottery guys, one might be doing bowls, the other ones might be doing jars. And what we can see is that in this thing, well, they all do pottery. And first, they will randomly pull themselves into the city by just taking any available random spot. That is not posing problem with the street. So they're getting wherever left spot is. And as these things tend to mature, we see another factor, which is these guys who tend to have the same similar activities, they tend to willingly move across the city to a different area when they will have the same businesses activities. So there is kind of convergence, and this is a really, really important set of maturities of ancient cities. When randomly plotted craftsmen tend to have the same competitive activities, they are at some point when the city grows big enough, willing to create their own kind of neighborhood. It's a process that doesn't happen on a day-to-night basis. It's really taking some longer terms, but it tends to do this, to create neighborhoods with the same set of activities. And that's very important because that shapes the city into the second stage in which some set of activities gets localized. And that's a very important set of maturity. What happens next is that once we start to get neighborhoods, okay, which perform different sets of activities, we see a recurring set of activities that actions in every ancient city. Is that out of these different neighborhoods, we start to see different castes emerging as well. In every ancient city, you will see slums, okay? Which is definitely a thing that is consistent in every ancient city. There are some different castes, creating slums and patriciate kind of things, higher standards of living guys and scam things. And in that perspective, this creates different standards of living inside and within the city. That's very important. That's the next stage of maturity. As people tend to regroup, these grouping behaviors tend to create different castes immediately. The emerging higher class is generally the one that will take role of administrating the city. They are the one that would say, well, we need to pay attention to this in the city or whatever. The first needs were generally to bring military and security to these things, to orchestrate the city and how we protect a shared sense of security. That's the first thing that always happened through time. The shared security is what emerged a higher caste within the city at the third stage. And it always came out with creating the same opposite reaction as downgrading some standards of living into slum. Though there are the craftsmen, okay, who perform their activity, they concentrate their activity on some neighborhoods, and orchestrating and organizing all of those neighborhoods quickly requires military force, which is creating administrative demand, which is generally creating a higher standard of living for those who do that activity, and in opposition creates some slums as lower standards of living. Very important thing to understand, okay? Very, very important things to understand. And at a later stage, what happens in the last is that this city will build itself as a shared security model with multiple forms. The most accumulative form that we've seen in ancient history is building walls around the city. At some point, we gather all together and we define boundaries. We say we're going to build a wall there, and you are part of the city, and you do not. So in that perspective, we define boundaries by a set of rules that we commonly agree on, and we define those boundaries. And then we build something that secures those boundaries. Either we build a hard wall, or we create patrols, meaning that this is the area in which the military will pass, this is the area in which the military doesn't pass. So you guys do whatever the fuck chaotic activity you want, no one's going to be there to regulate. But we define a clear set of boundaries between those two areas by some definite rules or hard-built walls, okay? That's what we have. That's really important for you to understand, okay? That's the way things happen. And the later stage of things is as once those walls are built, we see gates built to the external world, performing different sets of activities, okay? And they all create a subset of requirements, which are generally traders that do help facilitate trade between one external world or city or whatever and another. And these create some specific bridges. Like, for example, there is a bridge in which every ancient city brings its commodities through. But the merchants coming out from the outer world with goods certainly don't get through the same gate. Okay, those who come to trade goods comes from another gate. Those who come to trade commodities comes from a separate gate. We start to see specialization of imports and exports. And the last later stage of maturity of those cities is communicating with other cities. The ability to use a channel, and they generally build themselves over rivers or seas or oceans, and these are the final stage of maturities of those ancient cities. First, they were farmers, they built castles, they built walls around the castles. Then they matured some weird way of organizing a city that quickly evolved into bringing socializedly specialized neighborhoods. Orchestrating and organizing these neighborhoods require some kinds and forms of administration, which was generally to the form of security, which created the emergence of a higher standard of living people, and on the other hand, some slums. On a later stage, we agreed on a shared security limitation system, or at least on a composable system of sets of rules in which you are either part of it or not part of it. And at the boundaries of these things created gates in which some specific third layer kinds of people specialized activity were meant to trade some specific sets of goods from the outside world. And on a final eventual later stage, for those who were next to rivers and other communicative channels, they created external trade with other similar types of cities. And this is what happened for us through history. This is how we came from villages to complex city organization. And what we can see is that there are some different cities, different organizations. Some cities are built around the castle is in the center and the city is elsewhere. But there is one consistent way those different cities build themselves, and sometimes without even communicating to each other because of different continents first. So before they intercommunicate through rivers and oceans, they tend to build themselves into a similar way, even without knowing each other. Which means there's something at play. It's kind of a magic that led them to follow these paths. And this is what brought me to this model, and intrinsic similarities that there is today with the crypto market and its organization to build Web3, kind of a world of cities, and how these cities could definitely follow the same path as how the ancient world created himself through these steps that we've highlighted today. Okay, so that was first part of the video. Now we know each and every one of these steps, in which specific orders they've created themselves over time. Let's see what are the similarities. Though, of course, no shit Sherlock. I will use Cosmos first, because that's out of the three ones we've talked about, the one that matches the most in terms of the structure that the ecosystem has, and the similarities, the very, very interesting similarities that there is in the way and in the order that this ecosystem built itself over time. Of course, as well, we're going to compare this to AVAX and Polkadot as well, because the similarities are in here as well. Okay, so for Cosmos, what would be the Cosmos vision of the city building itself? Well, first and foremost, who's the fucking castle? Some people might say atom is the castle and so on. No, 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 no. Understand the flow of elements, in which order they occurred. ETH was there way long before. ETH is where the high-stake transactions value pool themselves. We already have layer 2s. This is the kind of living ecosystem that builds itself naturally around the castle, and these guys kind of live in an outer world. I mean, transaction fees above $1 and something, so far away from the initial vision of the people's blockchain. So ETH is what it is, and it's very less likely going to change. But we've created a microcosm around it, which is the layer 2, which is there to make it live and livable over time. What you have to understand with that model is that there is one very important gate as well, is that if the city is what's next to come, and if the city defines its own boundaries, there will be one particularly very interesting boundary that's going to be common between the castle and the ecosystem. So in terms of Cosmos, there's going to be a bridge, a gate between the two. And this gate is going to be massively important. This is where most of high-stakes transactions will occur. What people don't understand with this is that if ETH is the castle, well, do you really think Cosmos is going to take value off from the castle? Because I see people saying, well, Cosmos is trying to kill Ethereum. Well, fuck no, it's not. What Cosmos is doing is bringing a shitload of activity to the castle. And the high-stake transactions that will occur in the city, where do you think the deals will be performed? In the castle. Because this level of security is higher than this one. This level of security is much higher than both of them combined. So in that perspective, the high-stake transactions will be performed in the castle. So instead of taking value away from Ethereum, well, Cosmos is most likely building a shitload of transaction feeds that will, for some of them, few of them, but the higher value transactions of them will end up in Ethereum. So this is more of a gain-gain situation rather than a win-lose. It's really that. And these high-stake transactions will have to pass through a highly fucking secured gate. So, yeah, in terms of Cosmos ecosystem, I've always said that I don't believe in the Axelar way of doing things to be a sustainable bridge within ETH and Cosmos. Because I don't think it's going to have to be a multi-app blockchain kind of activity. It has to be a highly specialized bridge, which only role is to transact between Ethereum, layer 2s and layer 1s, and Cosmos. And I definitely think that Axelar might be good at doing it now, but it's not specialized enough. So I tend to believe that Axelar instead will be the gate to another type of gate, will be the bridge to another type of gate in this ecosystem, the non-IBC chains. Because IBC technology would be the equivalent of the standard that we use for our boundaries. If Cosmos is the way we build a city, the question is, what is it that defines the boundaries of Cosmos? So people will say, that's shared security, because that's the military stuff you talked about, whatever. I would say, absolutely not. If Cosmos is the way we regulate the city, the boundaries to be in the Cosmos is not to use shared security. It's never been hard-coded anywhere. No one fucking force you to use shared security in the Cosmos ecosystem. You can definitely be part of the game by just using two very absolutely necessary stuff. If you want to be part of the Cosmos, you need to use Tendermint as a consensus. Meaning you built your blockchain, your activity out of the Cosmos SDK, and you use IBC. So that's what it is. Being in the Cosmos, the frontier is using Tendermint and IBC. If you use both of them, you're in the city. If you use shared security, that's another layer of security. You can bring your own security in the city. You can have your own military. Of course, if you try to conflict with the dominant military, you're going to be kicked off the game. But the thing is that you can bring your own security. There are grades and shades of security within that city. You're free to go in as long as you use our standards, meaning that you leave some fucking free space for the roads and you behave this way on the roads. You use those standards, okay? The other thing is that, well, you can settle wherever the fuck you want, but as this ecosystem matures, you very likely will end up in an app-specific blockchain. You rather like to go in some specific areas rather than the others. What we've seen in ancient cities is as these neighborhoods became crowded enough, they tend to create some kind of a fractal organization, meaning that the big neighborhood first gets randomly organized, and then as more people go in, they get more specialized into some doings rather than others. Let's take our pottery example. Some people might be doing bowls and others might be doing jars. So in the first places, those 3 jars creator were basically randomly scattered across the same neighborhood, but in a later maturity stage, they will tend to converge to the same area, meaning that there will be specialized subsamples inside the app-specific blockchain. So as the ecosystem matures, we have more specializations and regroupment. Though there is a fractal, endless kind of progression in this ecosystem, which create themselves into sub-neighborhoods, sub-street sample stuff. They create their own marketplaces for their own specific kind of demands, and this is the way it is. So this is the current stage of maturity on Cosmos. Cosmos already agreed on the boundaries. Cosmos already built the applications blockchains. Cosmos is already letting them communicate through the channels in IBC. Cosmos already has the marketplaces. Cosmos is already starting to bring the subset of samples by starting to create applications on the app-specific blockchains. We're starting to see the craftsmen of work. That's a good point. The infrastructure is already there in Cosmos. We already have seen the patriciate who has emerged from the scam on the opposite hands. We also already see the bridges activities being there. They have different sets of bridging technology. There are some specific commodity type of bridge to Bitcoin. There is some specific bridge to Ethereum, which is the castle. I think we have some multipolarized type of bridge to non-IBC chains, because IBC is a standard protocol, meaning that we already build some compatible roads outside the city for those who don't use Tendermint, but still use our road system. But the thing is that this requires IBC relayers to filter in the messages. So this is kind of a message communication channel. This is kind of a commodity communication channel, value communication. This is like other types of cities in which, well, you definitely have some other cultures than the one we have in here. So we're going to filter your transactions before we process them, because we definitely do not talk the same language. So we're going to have to find kind of a language book, agree on multiple language. These would be the translators, the axolars of these things. How do we make different language being able to transact all together? Axelar, gonna be a big thing in Cosmos, but definitely not an ETH bridge. Okay, so I think this is very interesting for you to understand. And finally, last but not least, if Cosmos creates itself out of shared security for Atom, in that perspective, well, normally the communication channels, okay, that will export these things to other cities will generally have to be secured by the military. So I think over time we'll see probably something that isn't happening yet, but is probably going to come sooner rather than later, Atom secured IBC relayers. I think there's going to be IBC relaying to other Cosmos cities in a later stage, and these will have to be Atom secured. Like, I think in the later stage maturity, which we don't see now, Atom is not going to be sufficient enough to sustain the activity in the ecosystem, meaning that the city will grow so big that it will not be sustainable enough to keep on growing that city. Even though the boundaries of that city are not static, it's just upon integration. I think at some point, just the way the world evolved back then, we didn't have gigacities just like that. The first cities kind of reached the tipping top of the populations they could gather in. And what happened is that at some point, people decided to create other cities with their knowledge, meaning that some of the craftsmen at some point decided to live for better pastures out there. And they created other cities following the same model. But you have to understand that this is what happened in history, and I definitely think it's going to replicate as well. That's the reason why even the Cosmos creators themselves said, and I definitely agreed with that on day one, I think Atom is never going to be the only thing. Atom is one city, is one standard of shared security, and there's going to be many others afterwards. That's the reason why I've always said Cosmos vision is probably the one that's going to take over. It's the one that will process most of future transactions on the Web3 if this thing ever exists. But if it happens, it's not going to be all across atoms. It's not going to be one gigacity. It's going to be a multiple city communicating with others. This city being surrounded by atoms security, and it will have to communicate with other cities with their own respective security, and their own secured IBC layers will intercommunicate with each other to transport informations and goods and services and whatever. Okay, I think this is really what this is all about. If we take that system, that's the way I think it's going to build. Application-specific blockchains. Here we deal with NFTs, and we've got some specific set of NFTs, and they will regroup into, I don't know, art NFTs, I don't know, real estate NFTs, whatever it is. They're going to take some more specialized activities on some subsets, specialized neighborhoods, which will intercommunicate with their own subsets of dexes. But the first big dexes that are already there seems to be osmosis. These are the ones that help bridging transactions from big neighborhoods to other big neighborhoods and so on. Okay? In these NFT things, you will transact in one kind of currency in the first place before having others more specialized currencies. Trading those currencies requires passing by a DEX if you want to translate into another kind of currency and so on. You understand how these things goes. There is a patriciate, which is going to be those who organize, administrate the city, those who administrate through military by using shared security market cap of the atom, which makes the little soldiers patrol into some specific areas of the city. And there's of course this underlying security of atom, meaning that atom is a liquid asset that can go just everywhere. So even if some blockchains don't necessarily directly use the shared security model, which is a hard-coded security measure, meaning that you're gonna have to validate my chain, I think atom is going to be everywhere. Like, there's going to be security in this entire ecosystem because it's built around the atom. So having some atom collateral in this chain will mean that there is some intricate relationships between the two and financial security. So the soldiers will be everywhere in these things. Okay, that's the way I think it's going to be, and it's already taking these things. We've seen so many scam blockchains in Cosmos. So I think the ecosystem itself is mature enough now to accumulate a lot of organic demand. Applications, real applications being built onto these neighborhoods. We'll see if that is. Now, that was for Cosmos. Okay, so that's a good thing. But as usual, if you say, well, I've seen enough, Cosmos is the thing there, I'm going to buy Atom. Well, first of all, you haven't understood any fucking thing. Like I said, being a patriciate of that city doesn't mean it is uninteresting to be and go and look elsewhere. That doesn't mean you cannot make business on some specific app blockchains and so on. This is really a complex meshed ecosystem. If you would just want to be a rich and do nothing, like I've always said, go ETH. So that's really what this is. Okay, so now let's have a look at the other ecosystems, because there are definitely some very interesting similarities with others as well. So let's have a look at AVAX first. So AVAX difference would be, what could define AVAX participation? How do you define being inside or outside of AVAX? I would say it's pretty simple. In terms of AVAX, well, you know if you're in or out, because anyway, if you want to participate into the economic value of AVAX, meaning if you want to take a portion of the revenues, like the Atom delegators, in AVAX, well, that's simple. You have to have AVAX. In Cosmos, that's not the case. You can participate without holding Atom. It's not even going to be a big deal. It's no problem. You can be there and not using Atom. You're going to have to be some way interacting with Atom, but nothing is hard-coded and enforced. Well, for AVAX, it's this. You hold AVAX, you can participate. You do not, you can't. You can just interact with the merchants in the city, but you can't live there. No AVAX, you don't live. You don't participate in the economic exchanges of the city. So that's one thing. Because AVAX allows you to interact with neighborhoods, but you can't stay there. You can put your tent in there, you just can't, okay? You can transact, but you get the hell out of the city afterwards. You make a transaction and get out. Otherwise, if you want to sit in the city, like deploy, you're going to have to find a neighborhood, okay? And this neighborhood has to have its own security, but this own security has to participate in the broader security. That's the way AVAX consensus work. You can bring your own set of validators on any subnet. So what I like with AVAX is that it has this networking effect to understand that there will be neighborhoods in the cost in the way these things will build it themselves, because this is way ancient cities build. So this is built in from AVAX. There's going to be app specific blockchains. They already coded the dexes. It's going to be the C chain. There can be others, but it's very fairly incentivized to be the C chain, though the marketplace is secured by the military, the same military that patrols across the city. So it's like we've built common walls with AVAX, so solid walls in which the military patrols on top of. The military always also secures the DEX, and the military, of course, secures its own headquarters. Okay, so there's kind of a military basement, though if you use AVAX, you're part of the military and also part of the patriciate. Well, it sounds like it diverges a bit, but I would say there are some similarities and disparities. But the similarities are in here staggeringly as well. I'm still waiting to see the communication system of AVAX. They're going to be pulling them out, I think, pretty much sooner rather than later. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see. Because knowing about the AVAX team, it's probably going to be something very well crafted. And I'm very curious to see all about that. So the thing that I would say comparing AVAX to Atom is that it's pretty much similar in the way that there is composability in the system. There's app-specific blockchain, but there's a bit more rigid kind of way of doing things. I would say it's more like a religious way of doing things. In here, it's AVAX, and there's no open-minded. If you don't trust our code, get the fuck out. You can transact with us, but you can't stay there. So if you want to participate in the economic model, it passed by AVAX beliefs. Like I said, trust it or not. Some cities build themselves around these goals, and they have been pretty successful as well. So I see no big deal with that, but I see some differences. The thing is that the orchestration within the ecosystem in here is pretty similar to Cosmos, and there will be, I think, organization to this. The current state of AVAX means that there are barely a few subnets, so in terms of maturity, there's still a lot to do with AVAX, but I still tend to believe that it will likely orchestrate through this way. In order to confirm that, I'd like to see the interoperability protocols that AVAX will build to see if this is just totally different than what I anticipated or if it's going in the right direction. Though I think it's definitely going that way. What is going to be limited for AVAX is that as AVAX is AVAX, as we've seen, it's a belief. It's not something that can be exported and communicate with other AVAX. There's one AVAX, so there's one city. Though in terms of development over time, I see just one thing. AVAX can only be a gigafactory, kind of a gigantic evolving city, because the more people go in, the more we can push the walls further away. What's good with AVAX is that it's totally adaptable. The more people want to be in, the broader the city turns out to be. There is no hard-coded wall. It's free to expand infinitely. So I would say the bigger problem that AVAX faces that Cosmos doesn't, but it doesn't come without trade-offs, is that AVAX can grow much bigger than Atom could do for the current Cosmos. But we've seen that Cosmos can very likely and very likely will evolve to different secured zone out of atoms with Atom-like kind of cities with slight differences. So that's one very intrinsic difference and important thing to understand in our perspectives. And we'll see that later when we come to the charts, that we already see some hints that these things will likely play out, that in the end, AVAX City might be bigger than Atom City, but that the world will likely use Atom standards rather than AVAX's. That's one thing. We'll take on these one later. Okay. So that's it. And now let's go for Polkadot. So the differences that there is between Polkadot and the ancient city system model are significant. There are more significant differences from Polkadot. The first thing is that how do we define the boundaries for Polkadot? Well, just like AVAX, this is hard-coded. No Polkadot, no participation to the economic model. If you want to live in the city and transact in the city durably, you're going to have dots because there's no other way around. The other thing that there is that Polkadot has no castle. It has no true intrinsic need to have Ethereum, though I would say this is a city without castle. And I would also say that this is a city that has been hard-coded all across the board. There's going to be 100 parachains. There's going to be that many specific parachains and some other specific way of parachains. They can do totally different things, but they are hard-coded to be this. We have an interoperability protocol working already. It's working great. But it feels like, to me, in this model, Polkadot is no more than a squared city with squared blocks, and in which we have defined already which boulevard is going to cross which streets and whatever. Everything is hard-coded. It looks like an American city on the dreams. Like, everything has been hard-coded already. You want to be part of that city, it's dot boy. Because if you do not have a car, you do not drive down our streets. You want to walk? Fuck you. Car. So that's what it is. If you want to use our communication system, it's no walking, guys. It's just car only. So like I said, this is looking like more of a modern city, and eventually the dot system is the one that will prevail. But I tend to disagree with it. This is my personal vision of it, but I would say if I have to compare dot to this system, that's the one that diverges the most. That's also the reason why I don't like Polkadot. But like I said, I might be wrong. The model I'm using here is just no more than a model. So if you're a Polkadot fan, just don't yell at me, I'm an asshole or whatever. Just try to understand that, well, the model I use simply don't fit your trades. Make sure as well that you always risk manage your thing. Do not believe, but trade. Okay, though out of this model, I would say that the rigidity that is implemented by the dot consensus means that everything is already planned on the dot. You've got the councils, which are meant to be the patriciates. They orchestrate how the security is shared within the whole thing. So I would say this is what dot looks to me today. There are barely a few parachains. They're growing by the day, of course. But it looks to me like everything has been planned already. Everything is orchestrated already. We already know who's going to be the patriciate. We know how they will orchestrate security. We know where the boundaries are. We know there's going to be no more room for additional subsets or whatever. We exactly know how these things will pull themselves. We know how they will communicate. There are no specific decks. I mean, there's so many disparities with this. Okay, I still see no breach with Bitcoin. I still don't see the need with Ethereum in that system. I see eventually a communication channel to other ecosystems, but certainly not to similar things. There is, for example, Kusama, which is exactly the same thing, but there's no communication between dot and Kusama. So there's not going to be communication between dot-like ecosystem. It's going to be just one dot. Though this is an ecosystem that can eventually replicate, like we've seen, Kusama is a replication that somehow survived. So this is, at some point, I think, interesting eventually to see that this could eventually be proven wrong over time. In that perspective, dot could self-replicate itself over time. I think dot technology is very intrinsically interesting in the way it regulates all of this. But I think the composability of dot relies in one thing: not being dot. I think the dot's technological stack is great, but I think dot as the flagship of this thing is very likely going to fail. It definitely looks to me more like a Chinese pre-built city without citizens. That's what dot looks like to me. It looks like a good way to rigidly organize a city. But there's no one living in there for now. Remember that we're building networks for applications to develop on them. So really right now, for Polkadot, it's really more like we've built and hard-coded everything, but there's no one in there for now. Hopefully there will be someday, but this is, once again, irrational types of supply of demand mechanics. Organic demand will go wherever the others are going. So this is more of a trend effect. Where people go will attract others people to go and trade with. So dot has its chances, but in terms of the model that I use, too many divergences. Okay, so I think we've got it all now. It's right about time to look at the charts now to see how these three compares to the other model that I use and that you, of course, know about. So that's the thing. I'm going to compare them to ETH because, like I said, in my personal ancient model, there's one thing that is for sure is that Ethereum has to be there. It's the castle. It's the value reference for high-stake net-worth transactions. So, well, let's look at those. If we look at AVAX, I always use the same model. Very quick sum up of these. I use valuation areas. So the value areas for me are, if you're below 1%, you don't even exist. That means you're a piece, you're just too little to exist. So I don't pay attention to anything that is below 1% Ethereum as being a relatively viable solution. 3 to 4% valuation of ETH means, well, I exist and I am definitely intending to create something. 10 to 15% is I'm definitely a legitimate way to have complex interaction with you. Okay, that's really symbiotic relationship, still with one dominating and the other inheriting from it. So remember that ETH dominates and the others take on the ETH security for high stake transactions on their ecosystems, and they also naturally bring some of their value to ETH. Okay, so ETH is the value extractor of those sub economies. I have to understand that. Okay, so this is where I think the winner of that game will be. Okay, this is where I think all of the challengers will battle themselves with each other. This is where the losers will end up. I don't think there's going to be a loser, but I think there's one that will tend toward this valuation over time, still maintaining itself above. But this is why what my model is supposed to end up with. And I think it's not going to take more than 5 to 10 years. So 5 to 10 years from now, out of these three competitors, AVAX, DOT, and Atom, where is fucking Atom to ETH? Out of these three, there's going to be one in here, one in there, and one there. And we're going to try figuring out when. Though, looking at the historical charts again, just perspective, I think AVAX is in a good position. So AVAX has been non-existent. It emerged as a candidate, solidified its position as a candidate, entered the area of existence, sustained prices over there for quite some time, tried to be more than just a candidate, failed right back to reality, back to earth, and we're now trying to support the 3% area. That means AVAX is worth 3% of the Ethereum's market cap, okay? So that's interesting. Like we stated, if AVAX is the future city standard, this is where it's going to end up. In order to get there, the city has to be built and functional with people in there. So this is what the next cycle will differentiate. It's going to be the winner. So we definitely want to pay huge attention to AVAX. What we've seen is that, well, it already broke above the 5%, which is a good point. They're already traded in this area. Might be the sign that they want to get there in the future. And it's not necessarily going to be an easy thing, but it definitely looks like the early stages of a trending market. Has to be pulled themselves over time, meaning that as long as this context is rising, I see that the moving average is likely to pass below, which would be the sign of a potential trend. So good point in terms of technical structure for AVAX as being a candidate over time, but still a lot to prove. There are some good points, but first we need to hold on to the 3%. I definitely think that the recent AVAX activity suggests this area is an area of support. The question now is whether we're going to stay there and hold on into the 3% area, or try to go to the 15%. Okay? In terms of sizing, we've seen that the advantage that AVAX has is that it has infinite growth potential. The only limitation to AVAX is the fact that there is competition. If someone else takes on this growth than AVAX wants, though in my personal opinion, I hardly think AVAX is going to be the loser. I think AVAX is either going to end up there or there. It's going to take years. Remember, we're talking about 2025 to 2030. Okay? But this is what I think for AVAX, and this is what prices suggest. Invalidation for me would be reaching 1% area. As long as AVAX sustains over 3% Ethereum, I think it has the likelier chance to either maintain itself over there, so it grows just as fast as Ethereum grows, and the bigger the castle, the bigger the city can be, but there's no chance this one can grow faster. Option number 2, there's more room to grow the city than the castle already is, and then AVAX will take over. And I think in that perspective, it will grow relative to Ethereum, but don't ever think it will ever cross that level. 15 is going to be a big maximum level for me in terms of AVAX sizing. Okay, remember that it's a very viable economic model, but I don't think there can be only one city. Though I think AVAX is one of many solutions that there will be and that will coexist. But this one has an infinite sizing, but the thing is that as it grows too big, it extracts bigger value, which means as ecosystems will likely be interoperable, if the city grows too big, where others are offering more interesting opportunities, I think that, well, some of the AVAX protocols will migrate to another chain. So if it grows too big without growing with the rest of the ecosystem, I think AVAX value accrual might deteriorate over time due to the fact there will be more attractive opportunities elsewhere. But I definitely think that the business model of AVAX is something that means, in my personal opinion, I think it's the one that will win. But I'll explain about that. Then comes Polkadot. Let's go Polkadot. Okay, so dot Ethereum with the same value areas. Whoa, look at that. Dot is the first one that ever succeeded getting into the 10 to 15 area. It even tried to top on top, to go topish over it. And the problem is that now dot is right back to earth as well, going right back down to 3 to 5%. The 1% mark is in here. That's the historical low of Polkadot versus Ethereum. Okay, so there's one thing we could say is that, first of all, there has been an attempt, but it hasn't been successful at all. All we can see is that it has been rejected so far. So the 10 to 15 area, I would say Polkadot has its time to shine, but the history says it doesn't anymore. So as I stated earlier, the charts tend to confirm the assumption that I made. Currently, dot doesn't look good at all. In this battle, they're losing strength rather than gaining it. Where AVAX is going up, dot is going down. Most importantly, we're already in an area in which the best case scenario is, in my personal opinion, it stays there. Worst case scenario, it goes right down to 1%. I never said it would die, so remember that. Dot is here to stay. It's a good model, but this rigid squared city system, I think, is not necessarily what's going to attract more attention. It's too rigid, and history has told that we emerge order from chaos, not the opposite. So cities have organized themselves out of chaos. That's what I always believed. I might be wrong, but I think just Polkadot has gone the other way around, and that's probably what's going to cause him to go there. So my personal forecast is, you guessed it, if AVAX is ending up in a 10 to 15 area, and if dot is going there, why the heck do I think Atom is going there? You know, Atom is the overweighted asset in my portfolio, so how come I could be overweighting fucking Atom and not AVAX? I'll explain. So now let's go into Atom. Atom versus ETH has always maintained its existence. So there is still a likely chance that Cosmos all along has just been bullshit. And in that perspective, as we've seen, dot will maintain its state on 3 to 5%. And well, Atom will be the only one to try surviving at a barely visible 1% market cap of Ethereum. Or option number 2, this is where Atom is headed. After being absolutely underperforming for the rest of the cycle, it will gain traction, and I think it will very quickly be able to go 3 to 5%. I think this is where Atom is oscillating, basically. We've already traded into this area. There is no rejection for this. We just traded out there. There has been an attempt to reject, but this attempt has created a higher low point, meaning that right now, I think we're not going to reject. We're on course to get there and stay there. So in terms of momentum, I think the next value stage for Atom is to be 3 to 5% Ethereum, right along with AVAX and Polkadot. So this is why I'm overweighting currently Atom, because I think all the gamers are going to be setted into the same area to start the race. Why do I overweight Atom then? Because I think Atom is the one that has the likeliest chances to attempt a breakout. Okay? Because we have rising bottoms, this area is going to be very least resistance. We already have a third range boundary, meaning that big fucking range is mature. If there's one that is able to break out and try to break and sustain prices over 5% market cap of Ethereum, I think that's Atom. The thing is that if it does that, I don't think Atom can stay there for 10 years. Like I've said, I think the structural vision of Atom as part of the cosmos is not sustainable over time. So my major thing in here is that I think Atom is going to have the strongest momentum within the next 2 to 5 years, but I don't think it's going to last if it ever breaks to attempt 10 to 15% Ethereum. Because if it does, remember the intrinsic problem we've highlighted with Cosmos in general. Cosmos' shared security model is very likely going to be orchestrated around Atom in the first place, but if for some reasons the Atom ecosystem, the Atom-centric shared security ecosystem of Cosmos is taking too big and is growing to extract too much value, well, another city will create, and it will naturally be interoperable with this one, meaning that protocols will very rapidly be able to migrate to another city, which will extract less value. Just take on that example. If you live in a city in which the military is asking for 10% of your creation, and imagine, I don't know, you're a bakery. You've made 10 cakes and the military comes to take one each and every day. You're going to say, fuck, at some point, I'm willing to do it because I like the city. I've been used to live there all along. But if that 1 cake a day turns out to become 2 cakes a day, you still can't produce more than 10, so you've just doubled your fees. And in that perspective, if that increase is too big, and if you somehow learned that another city just a boat trip ahead is available and is taking half that fee, you're going to get there. You know the security will be lower, but you'll say, well, I have more room to grow still, maybe in a less secure manner, but I'll get there anyway. So understand that the composability and liberty that is offered by the Cosmos ecosystem, that's why I think Cosmos is by large going to be the one that will realize the most transactions in the future. But in terms of economic value of the token, I think Atom, if it ever succeeds breaching to the 10 to 15% of ETH market cap, it's not going to stay there long. So that's the reason why I think 10 years from now, and lots of things could change, but this is the model I'll take now. I think DOT will nearly survive over 1% if it still survives, and there might be some other competitors taking its spot. I think AVAX, if there is demand for this ecosystem, as it can grow infinitely, I think in terms of market shares related to the big boy Ethereum, is the only ecosystem that has the chance to have both the composability and the scalability to survive relative to Ethereum as a token, okay? As an ecosystem, I think it will be the second one. By far, first one will be Cosmos, but there will be far more than just Atom-secured zones. Then, afterwards, as a secondly used ecosystem, AVAX. But the thing is that the value concentrated on the AVAX token will over time, I think, be bigger than what it could be for Atoms. And when it comes to Polkadot, I think it's way too rigid to ever succeed. But like I said, this is my personal assumption. If I ever turn out to be wrong, I will switch my game. Okay? There's only one out of Atom and DOT that can take the second and first spot. Though, I personally think that the order is this. I think DOT will still have use cases, but I think it will just lose relative value over the rising competitors. I think that DOT is not losing strength anytime soon related to its current market cap. I just think that the demand will mostly go elsewhere. Most of the developers will go on other perspectives, cheaper chains. There will be more activity elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that the value extracted of these activities won't make significant revenues for DOT holders. Having 1% of the Ethereum market cap still means something. I think DOT is a fairly solid business. My assumption is that it will be the loser in this game because it has a decreasing momentum. But if it ends up being proven me wrong about that, meaning that if for some reasons DOT reverse courses, well, it's going to have absolutely no problem going back to the 10 to 15 because it's an already visited area. But as long as the bearish momentum plays in, as long as the bottoms are decreasing, low highs and lower lows, I don't want to gamble on DOT. I think it's too dangerous. If it reverse course, I'm going to change my game immediately. But so far, all I see is that we're crossing through the 2 to 5%. I definitely don't nearly think DOT will ever be close to 1% within the next couple of years. I think it's going to take 10 years for DOT to exit out of the 3 to 5 areas. Like I said, I don't think the DOT project will fail. I think the DOT project will just not attract as many people as people initially thought. It's a big city on the paper, but it's an empty city for now. And I think that's what will cause DOT to remain subdued. good projects, but not necessarily suitable enough for scalability because of the intrinsic rigidity of its system. Future will eventually prove me wrong. In the meantime, guys, we're more than enough on this one. It's right about time we switch to conclusion. All right, so if I had to sum up the core informations that I've been spreading here with 1 hour long video, so I'm going to make this one real quick. I think that this is a very complex game, but if I use the model that I use right now, which has sincerely very complex similarities with the way that human civilization constructed himself out of first layer of organizing ourselves into little communities in which we shared food and feeding mechanisms, which is basically putting farmers all together, into how we evolve these things into creating more complex interaction. I think this is what ETH has been creating on top of the blockchain ecosystem. So as long as this model plays in, as long as we have more complex interactions with blockchains than just transferring value in Bitcoin, well, I think that model is just the beginning of something way more complex that so many people have seen way beyond. That's the Web3. I think that between what we are right now and the Web3, there is an emerging evolution that is going to be necessary. And if we look at the comparison of this through human civilization maturity, I think the stage we're headed to is this. How we transition from farmers, villages, to complex organized cities, and how then in the end those multiple cities ended up communicating with themselves, with each other, using either compatible way of communication, meaning the same language, though we can communicate through the same simple gates because we have the same fucking language. Then, of course, we can transact with external kind of systems that do not even speak our language. So we need translators who can help us trade still, because it's all about trade. That's what happened in history, folks. These things, we have traces of it. So I think that history is telling us one thing in here, that first of all, history doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it fucking rhymes. And there's so many rhymes that I can see with this. And in terms of global structure of those ecosystems, the ones that succeeded over time through natural selection, there have been multiple cities attempts, but the one that survived long enough through histories, not the one that were built out of squares. These ones eventually emerged at a very late stage when the US, far complex advanced cities, decided to square things in. Back then, everything was fucking chaotic, and it structured itself from the bottom to the top. And as these things mature, and as more complex the economical activity turns out to be, we had these infinitely scalable effects that we've seen as fractal thing, meaning that as at some point cities reached out a tipping top point, meaning that the city was too big, that the interactions were so complex, we've made things easier by taking the knowledge of those cities and creating others with them. That's how the world evolved. We haven't created a single big city in which everything happens. There were megalopolises out there, the Romes and things like that, and that's what I think AVAX is. I think AVAX is like the antique Roman Empire, in which there's definitely one fucking big city, but there are so many others out there. And the thing is that AVAX has been hard-coded to be the only one. That's what I don't like with it. That's why I don't think AVAX is an end on it. I think AVAX is one part of a much bigger puzzle. And I think the bigger parts of that puzzle are Cosmos chains, and Cosmos zones, and Cosmos cities. But if there's one that can capture a shitload of value, and can grow big enough to self-sustain itself over time, I think that's the AVAX system. So yeah, some people said I've always shitted on AVAX. I'm not. I definitely think that's the most stabilized system to work itself over significantly bigger types of city, sizes of city. I think Cosmos is not suited for giga-cities. I think AVAX does, but the thing is that giga-cities built themselves over time. They didn't emerge as giga-cities. So that's the thing. I think that Cosmos is headed first. They will create intermediate-sized city around Atom first, and we might try to find the limits of Atom until it bursts, meaning that we go too big on atoms and then it forces us to create similar types of cities. That's the way I think history has been building itself, and that's the model that I follow. I think Atom will take the lead within the next cycle. So much of a lead that it will grow too big. Too big that it will not fail, but it will find its toppish limit. And then It will export the knowledge, the Cosmos stuff, everywhere else, because the people will say this is magnificent to create value. We're going to use that same old system. It's easy to use. It's easy to build. We can build similar cities very quickly. That's exactly what happened back then. When the city became too crowded, people started taking ships and build their own fucking city elsewhere, using the same model that has been built by the initial city. And I think that's exactly what Cosmos has done. Out of a bazaar, they created organized channels of communications. They created a consensus mechanism that creates kind of a cult. That's really what this is. We're using the same cult. We believe in the same God. So yeah, that's it. We're going to build a Tendermint cult. Okay, but despite that, that's all it is. I think in AVAX, this is more than just a cult. AVAX is a limits, intrinsic limits of a fortress. Though these fortresses can grow big, but it takes time as well. So that's the reason why I think over time, AVAX is going to be the biggest market cap of these three. Could eventually change this perspective to Polkadot eventually, because Polkadots could grow big as well. But I think the big problem is it's all been hard-coded since day one, and it's too rigid to be in that spot. I will be willing to change if my charts changed, but for now, all I see is a decreasing force and strength of Polkadot, a stagnating but waiting to shine force of Atom. And I see an AVAX that is just standing still and waiting for its time to come. I think AVAX is trending, but it's a trend that will take 10 years to pull itself. So be patient with AVAX. It's not going to be a rising star. I think it's just going to be a slow grinding boy. That being said, I think I said it all. Hope you've learned something, guys. As usual, all of this, what I said, might just be sounding smart of the vision of the future or whatever. Remember that anyhow and anyway, it's all come down to trading. Trading means look at the fucking charts. And if they say a different story, change the story. Bye, guys.